So there were some folks boarding an airplane. They got on the airplane, found their seats, and to their surprise, boarding the airplane were two men dressed as pilots, except for one of the men had one of those blind person canes, the white ones, and the other one, who was a pilot or dressed as a pilot, had a seeing eye dog. And they went past some of the people in the aisle and then went up into the cockpit and shut the door. Now, the people on the airplane kind of looked around nervously like, is this a practical joke? That's not funny. And before you knew it, the plane started to roll down the runway. And the people thought, I don't really think this is very funny. And a little murmur arose in the cabin. The plane started going faster and faster and faster, and people started becoming a little bit worried, especially as they looked out the window and noticed that the runway, or the end of the runway, was soon approaching, and beyond that was water. And the plane gained speed, and it didn't look like it was going to take off, and that murmur turned into some noise, and before you knew it, the end of the runway was there, and the people screamed, and the plane took off into the air. The people breathed a sigh of relief, and up in the cockpit, the one captain said to the other, you know, one of these days, they're not going to scream, and we're not going to know when to take off. Today's message is about being able to see, both physically and, more importantly, spiritually. As a reminder, we're in a series called Believe It or Not. It's a series where we look at some of the strange, bizarre, and frankly weird stories that are found in our Bible. And I love this kind of series because there are so many places to learn some unique and interesting truths that a lot of times as Christians we tend to skip over, maybe because they are bizarre or because we don't understand them. Now, today's story in the Gospel of John, we're going to ask an important question, and that is this: why does Jesus use spit and mud to heal a guy? By a show of hands, how many of you think that's kind of a little weird? How many of you would be okay with somebody spitting on the ground, working it into a little mud pie, and putting it on your eyes? A couple people, yeah, me, right? In the process of seeking to answer this question, I believe that there's a lot that we can learn. So those of you that are taking notes, you have the weekly there in front of you. There's a place to take notes. The sermon is called, Here's Mud in Your Eye, which, by the way, that phrase comes from this story in the Bible. Let me give you a little background. As we enter this narrative in John chapter 9, Jesus has just barely escaped death. He's had this conversation with the Pharisees. He claims to be God. The Pharisees see this as blasphemy. They pick up stones to kill Jesus, and Jesus sort of slips out from their midst. It's a fascinating passage. I would encourage you to read chapter 8. It does set this story up well. But as he's escaping, he and his disciples pass this man who the Bible says has been blind since birth. And the disciples ask an interesting question. They want to know, whose fault is it that this man is blind? Look at what it says in verse 2. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, this is such an important question because before we get to the weird stuff, the bizarre stuff, we have to hit pause and address this because it's a question that we are very often tempted to ask today as well. When we're struggling, when we're sick, when we're going through financial problems, when we can't start the car in the morning, we're tempted to ask, Lord, what did I do to deserve this? Did I not pray enough? Is it because I missed church last week? Is it because I'm not giving enough money to the church? What did I do to upset you that you are making my life difficult? Whose fault is it that I'm struggling? This is what's beautiful about Christianity. Jesus is going to go into some detail and say, look, it's not because this guy sinned or it's not because his parents sinned. There's something much, much bigger going on. And this is one of the reasons I love Christianity. You know, most other religions are based on sort of this action-reaction system. For example, if you're Hindu, you are working towards this spiritual perfection. You are trying to do the right thing so that when you die, the next time you will come back a little bit better. So they believe that maybe like a dog, if the dog is a good dog, when the dog dies, it might come back as a horse. Thank you. Horses seem better than dogs. I don't know why. And if the horse is good, he might come back as a person. And if you're a good person, you might come back as a better person. And you work your way up these levels. But if you're a bad person, you might go back down to being something else, like a frog or something. Now, in Buddhism, they have this thing called the Eightfold Path. It consists of 8 practices: the right view, the right resolve, the right speech, the right conduct, the right livelihood, the right effort. All these things, if you do all those things right, you can reach this nirvana. But if you do those things wrong, no, you're punished. Islam has a 5-step plan. You must do all 5 steps to achieve paradise. If you don't do those things, you do not achieve paradise. And for most people, that kind of makes a lot of sense, because life sort of works like that, doesn't it? I mean, if you do the right things at home, your parents are pleased with you. They may give you some money, or they may give you extra dessert, or they may let you stay out later. But if you do the wrong things, you get no dessert. You have to come in early, or maybe you're even grounded, or no video games. Collective shock right here. Don't even say that. Jobs are like that too. If I do the right thing, if I get this project done, if I get it done on time, my boss rewards me, maybe I get a raise. If I don't do the project well, then maybe I get fired. All of life sort of has this action-reaction mode, but Christianity is the one that's really quite different. Listen carefully. In Christianity, when you follow Jesus, your faults do not count against you. Somebody say amen. Your faults do not count against you. And, more importantly, your good works don't count for you. You're not penalized for what you did, and you get no extra credit for what you do. You don't make God happy with your works. It says in the book of Isaiah, your good works are like filthy rags to me. We have freedom in Christ because of what he did. So it's not an action-reaction system, but we're very much tempted to ask these kind of questions. Somebody said one time, Christianity was just invented to try to control people, to make them better people. Well, if so, there's a really bad plan. Because once you believe in Jesus, there's nothing you can do to get any closer to God. Jesus is the one that brings you to God. So it still leaves us asking this question, well then why do bad things happen to people? You probably know some people who you would consider very good people, and yet there's some very difficult things that have happened or are happening to them. So let's look at Jesus' answer for the blind man, and I believe it will be true for us too. Here's Jesus' answer to them. It was not that this man sinned or his parents, pay attention, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. This is a foreshadowing. If you're a disciple right now, you're like, this is about to be good. The works of God are going to be displayed in this guy. They should know what's going to happen because they've been with Jesus. They watched him feed 5,000 people. That was an incredible miracle. They watched him walk on water. That was unbelievable. And they watched him heal dozens and dozens of people. And Jesus points out that there's a purpose for this man's trouble. There's a purpose for his blindness. And the purpose is going to be the glorification of God. It makes me wonder. When I struggle, when I feel like I'm being punished, when I can't deal with my own anger, when I get sick, any problem that I have, could it be that God is allowing that in my life because he's planning to display his glory in me? That's his purpose. It kind of changes everything, doesn't it? It's not that God made this man blind. It's not some kind of cruel joke. I'm going to use this guy to display my greatness. It's that in our human world, accidents happen. People do get sick. Mistakes are made. People hurt each other. Diseases materialize. People are born blind. It's just a reality of living in the fallen world. But you also realize that you have a choice. And when you're going through something difficult, you can choose to figure out who to blame, or you can believe. You can try to figure out whose fault it is, or you can have faith. And a lot of times we walk around trying to figure out, well, whose fault is it? Who could I blame? Instead of realizing this may be a tremendous opportunity for God to be glorified. Look at verse 6. Having said these things, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And he went and washed and came back seeing. Okay, let's just put ourselves in that place for right now. They're in Jerusalem, near Jerusalem. This is a very dry and arid climate, very dusty. Sort of think maybe like Arizona. And a lot of times if you've heard this story before, you go, oh yeah, Jesus spat on the ground. He kind of did that. And he kind of made this little, poultice out of mud or whatever. But I want you to think about for a moment, what does it really take to spit on the ground enough to make up a little bit of mud? It's a loogie. Thank you very much. It's okay for us to be grossed out about this. Like he's got to produce some saliva and spit on the ground and then bend down, scoop it up. It's all muddy and mushy in his hands. And then he takes it and he rubs it onto this guy's eyes. If I did this live right here, which I thought about doing to illustrate, you would be more grossed out than you are now. And you would be like, number one, I'm not going to be able to eat lunch. Number two, I'm not coming back till you guarantee you're not going to do that anymore. It's pretty gross. It's pretty weird. It's bizarre. And here's the weird thing. It's actually something that Jesus did often. Did you realize that? One time, they brought a blind man to Jesus. He didn't actually spit in the dirt with this guy. He just spit right onto his eyes. Hello. I feel bad for the blind guy because he didn't see it coming. Oh, that's too far. One time, they brought a guy who was deaf and had trouble speaking. Jesus spit into his hands like this, put his fingers in the man's ears, asked the man to stick his tongue out, and put the spit on the man's tongue. That's Jesus. Now, you might be thinking, man, Jesus, what is up with that? Because I've read other parts of the Bible where you just simply said, be healed, and the guy was healed. Or you just put your hand on somebody and the person was healed. Or the one time, the woman who had been very sick, she just reached up and touched his robe and she was healed. So why all of the theatrics? Why all of the grossness? What is this all about? Well, you know what's interesting? And you might not have realized this, and I didn't realize this until I started studying it. At this time in history, the idea of using saliva to heal somebody is actually very common. You can find this in history books that were written near and around that time. The use of saliva on wounds was actually a very common practice. Now you might think, well, that's because they didn't know anything about medicine. You know, if somebody got a cut or something, you spit on it. Well, that's what they did. Saliva was used for wounds, for rashes, for boils, all kinds of things. And here's what's fascinating. You think, man, they didn't really know anything. They were very primitive. Well, I did a little research. This is from the National Center for Biotechnical Information. It's the government website on medicine. It's talking about saliva in wound healing. For example, it says oral wounds, so these are sores that you have in your mouth, heal much faster with less scar formation than skin wounds. One of the key factors involved is saliva, which promotes wound healing in several ways. Saliva contains several proteins which play a role in the different stages of wound healing. Saliva contains substantial amounts of tissue factor, which dramatically accelerates blood clotting. Subsequently, epidermal growth factor in saliva promotes the proliferation of epithelial cells. I don't know what that means, but it sounds cool. This is what God designed. And people used it, and Jesus was just taking a page out of the current medical practice at that time. And you might think, well, that sounds weird. That's not true. Well, guess what? Do you know that you have an automatic response? It's built into you. What do you do when you cut your finger? Now, some people don't do that, but most people, that's what you do. That's built into you because that produces healing. So it kind of leads us back to this original question. Why does Jesus use spit and mud? Are you ready? Because it's important to see that miracles are often a mixture of God's miraculous nature and medicine put together. God is often using regular medicine and the faithfulness of people plus his power to do the right thing. Here's a good example. Some of you know this. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, I got really sick. I had bronchitis. So I went to my doctor, and my doctor gave me some stuff to help me stop coughing. What I didn't realize was that stuff made me throw up. A lot. I could not stop throwing up. Every time I tried to drink something, I would throw it back up. Boy, this is a really gross sermon, isn't it? And for about 2 days, that happened until I found myself laying in bed, pretty sure I was going to die. If you've ever been severely dehydrated, you know that feeling. And it was a really weird time for me because my daughter was about to graduate high school. The very next day, my mother-in-law had just flown into town, and I was laying in bed thinking, so this is how it ends. Who's going to preach on Sunday? Oh, they'll figure that out. My wife came into the room. She saw that I was really, really sick and in a lot of pain. And so she did the one thing that anybody would do. She called Dr. Mark, who goes to our church. Actually, she called Carol, Dr. Mark's wife, and she said, I'll call Dr. Mark. And she called Dr. Mark. She was out on a walk. This is why this story is so great. She was out on a walk, and Dr. Mark was doing some music, so he couldn't really hear what was going on. And she heard in Stephanie's voice this sound of like, I think my husband's dying. And so instead of walking home to get a hold of Mark, she ran home. I know, it's touching, isn't it? And we talked to Dr. Mark on the phone. He said, oh, you know what? You're severely hydrated. Dr. Mark is an emergency physician. He said, I'm not working today, but I'm going to call the hospital where I work. I'm going to tell them you're coming on in. I'm going to tell them what they need to do. Just head out the door. I'll take care of it. And I hobbled into the car, and Stephanie drove us there, and we got to the hospital, and they said, are you Pastor Phil? And I said, and they said, come right on in here. And the first thing they did was put some saline in me. And after I got one bag of saline, I was good as gold. Now you might say, that's not a healing. Oh yeah? It was for me. Because not only did I feel better, I got to attend my daughter's graduation the next morning and the party. Yeah, you can clap for that. This was God working through this family of believers and through the technology that exists to help us get better. Now, you might be thinking, so are you saying that only God heals through proper medicine? No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying sometimes that's how it happens, and I'm saying that's still miraculous in its own way. But sometimes God heals without any medicine at all. He just heals people. And it's an interesting subject. Let's talk about this for a second. Because some believers are very skeptical about this. They believe that healing is done, but there are many, many stories about it. And I want to share just a couple of them. This one is really, really interesting. This just happened recently. I'll put this up on the screen here. This girl whose name is Roxley Doss. She was diagnosed with something called diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma. It's a brain tumor. It's inoperable, and it is a killer. The article says a girl's inoperable brain tumor is gone, and doctors have no explanation. The doctor says it's very rare, but when we see it, it's a devastating disease. But then it says the family held a benefit for her in August, and the community responded in a big way in prayer. At that point, the family, that was all they had left, was to pray for a miracle. And Mom says, we got it. She went back in for an MRI, and they could not find the tumor. You'll find this all over the internet. This is a true story. Sometimes God does that. Here's another story. This is a really, really interesting story. This is about a guy named Nabil Qureshi. He converted from Islam to Christianity and wrote a book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. Brilliant guy. He was diagnosed with stomach cancer in 2016, but he passed away in 2017. Sometimes God heals and sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he heals and sometimes he doesn't. And your first thought might be to compare these stories and say, well, the girl must have done something right. They must have prayed correctly. They must have had the right amount of faith because she was healed and maybe he didn't. He must have done something wrong. Is her faith great and his is not? And we ask questions like that, just like the disciples. Who's to blame for this? And Jesus says, remember, it's not because the man sinned that he's blind, but because the works of God will be displayed in him. Here's what I'm saying. In both of these cases, in Roxley's case and in Nabil's case, God's work and power has been displayed. We read her story and it's amazing, but guess what? Here's what's interesting. Since Nabil died, his book has jumped to the #1 bestseller. I have a thing for this. #1 bestseller category. And do you see the category it's #1 in? Islamic rituals and practice. And it's rated 4.9 stars with almost 4,000 people. This is God being glorified. Now, in the case of this man that was healed, this is exactly what happened too. The whole town was in a buzz. And I would encourage you to read the rest of this later, but I'll just give you the overview. This miracle tipped off a flurry of discussion and controversy in that area. And the man was like hauled in before the Pharisees and they questioned him about this. And they're like, who is this Jesus guy? And the blind man's like, I don't know, but he healed me. And that wasn't good enough for them. So they hauled in this blind man's parents to verify that he was actually blind from birth. And they said, look, you can ask him yourself. So they brought the guy back in again. And eventually they kicked him out of the synagogue. They didn't like his answer. They certainly didn't like Jesus. And on his way out of the synagogue, check this out, he runs into Jesus again. And look at verse 35. This is the conversation between Jesus and the man who was blind. Presumably, the man, after he came back from the pool of Siloam, had not seen Jesus yet. Jesus says, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he answered, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? And Jesus says, you have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. Jesus says, you're looking at him. Instantly, this man, he says, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. He was cured of physical blindness, and he was cured of spiritual blindness. And ultimately, that's the goal. Spiritual blindness is an affliction that continues to this day. It's all about the soul and the body. It's all about people not wanting to engage the truth of who Jesus is. So let me ask you this morning, do you believe in the Son of Man? Can you see him in your soul, or are you blind to him? My prayer is that after reading this story, you would realize that Jesus exists to give you a spiritual sight, that you would worship him and that God would be glorified through it. Let's pray.